Marcus Webb stood in the Denver airport terminal, his military-issue carry-on slung over one shoulder, and felt something he rarely admitted to anyone: exhaustion, not the physical kind that a good night's sleep could cure. This was the bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that came from burying 3 of your closest friends in the span of 2 weeks. 3 men he'd flown alongside for over 20 years. 3 voices that would never again crack jokes during pre-flight briefings. 3 families he'd sat with at their kitchen tables, searching for words that didn't exist. At 48 years old, Marcus had retired from active military duty 5 years earlier, but retirement hadn't quite freed him from the bonds of brotherhood forged in the cockpits of F-15 fighters. He was still called upon for memorial services. He was still expected to deliver eulogies. He was still the one who remembered every mission, every close call, every moment that had cemented these men as something more than colleagues. They were brothers. The first funeral had been for Colonel James "Jimmy" Patterson, a man Marcus had flown with during the Gulf War. Jimmy had suffered a massive heart attack at age 52, completely unexpected and utterly unfair. Marcus had stood at the graveside in Arlington Cemetery, watching Jimmy's flag-draped coffin lower into the earth, his jaw clenched so tight he thought his teeth might crack. He'd saluted with precision, the military discipline that had shaped his entire adult life kicking in automatically. But inside, something was breaking. Then came David Chen, dead in a car accident on the way home from work. 49 years old, a brilliant tactical strategist, a man who'd saved Marcus's life during a mission over Bosnia by spotting a surface-to-air missile that should have taken him down. David's widow had looked at Marcus across the funeral reception with eyes so empty that Marcus couldn't bear to hold her gaze. She'd gripped his arm and whispered, "Why is it always the good ones?" He had no answer. The third funeral, just 5 days ago, had been the breaking point. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas "Tommy" Rivera, Marcus's closest friend and the man who'd introduced him to his wife 30 years ago. Tommy had died of cancer, a slow, agonizing decline that Marcus had watched helplessly over 3 months. Visiting Tommy in the hospital, watching a man who'd survived combat missions across 3 continents reduced to a whisper of himself, that had finally cracked something inside Marcus that he couldn't repair by simply standing straighter or pressing forward. After Tommy's service, his wife Sarah had pulled Marcus aside. She'd looked at him with the clarity that only comes from losing everything. "You need to live, Marcus," she'd told him, gripping both his hands. "Don't spend what's left of your life just being brave for the rest of us. Go, do something for yourself. Promise me." He'd promised, though at that moment he couldn't imagine what life looked like outside of this pattern of grief and duty. So he'd booked this flight to San Francisco. Not because he had anywhere important to go, but because he needed to be in motion. He needed the white noise of travel, the anonymity of being a stranger in a crowd. His old friend Robert had a beach house there that he'd offered freely, no questions asked. Marcus planned to spend 10 days doing nothing, sleeping, reading, walking on the beach, and maybe, just maybe, finding his way back to being a man instead of a monument to fallen soldiers. The airport moved around him in that strange Thursday afternoon rhythm. Travelers dragged their roller suitcases, businessmen typed on their phones, young couples held hands on their way to romantic getaways. Marcus envied them their simple worries. He moved through the concourse like a ghost, his mind somewhere between the Arlington Cemetery and whatever waited in San Francisco. He went through security with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it hundreds of times. His Air Force jacket remained carefully folded in his carry-on. He'd learned over the years that wearing the uniform off-duty invited unwanted conversations, well-meaning thank yous, and occasionally, hostile confrontation. He preferred to blend in these days. The man you saw was just an aging professional in jeans and a faded sweater, not decorated combat pilot with more kills than he liked to remember. The gate area was moderately full. Marcus found a seat away from the clusters of families and business travelers. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through emails without really reading them, and noticed his ex-wife had sent a text message. Jennifer wanted to know how he was holding up after Tommy's funeral. She'd always been kind to him, even after their divorce 15 years ago. She still called when there was military news that might affect him. Still seemed to care about whether he was eating properly or sleeping at night. He didn't respond, What would he say? That he was fine? They both knew he wasn't, that he was broken. That seemed too honest for a text message. When boarding was called for the Denver to San Francisco flight, Marcus gathered his things and moved to the line with everyone else. The flight attendant scanned his boarding pass, and he walked down the jet bridge into the aircraft and found himself in seat 8A, the window seat. Perfect. He stowed his carry-on, his Air Force credentials tucked safely inside, and settled into the seat. A businessman took 8B, immediately pulling out his laptop. An elderly woman took the aisle seat, immediately arranging 3 books and a travel pillow. Marcus nodded at both of them politely but said nothing. He'd learned that establishing he was the strong, silent type usually meant being left alone for the flight. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its slow taxi to the runway, Marcus pressed his forehead against the cool window glass. Denver sprawled below them, utterly indifferent to the drama of individual human lives. From 35,000 feet, the city would look peaceful. The problems that consumed people, death, loss, guilt, responsibility, would all seem small and insignificant. The takeoff was smooth. The seat belt sign dinged off. The flight attendants began their drink service. Marcus declined water or coffee. He just wanted to close his eyes and let the white noise of jet engines wash everything away. His head rested against the window. His body, running on 3 hours of sleep and pure adrenaline for 2 weeks, finally gave in to exhaustion. His breathing deepened. His hands, which had been clenched in his lap for days, finally relaxed. His mind, which had been replaying eulogies and graveside moments and hospital visits on a constant loop, finally went quiet. Marcus Webb, the weary warrior, the survivor, the man who'd answered every call and never faltered, finally surrendered to sleep. He had no idea that in 45 minutes, that sleep would be interrupted by a captain's desperate voice asking for help. He had no idea that fate had positioned him exactly where the universe needed him to be. For now, he was simply a sleeping man in seat 8A, finally, mercifully at peace. Captain Jennifer Martinez had logged over 18,000 flight hours across a 32-year career. She'd flown through thunderstorms that should have torn her aircraft apart. She'd experienced engine failures, hydraulic malfunctions, and once, a windshield that cracked at 35,000 feet. She'd handled every crisis with the calm professionalism that her crew trusted and her passengers never knew they should be grateful for. But as she stared at her instrument panel at 1:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, watching systems fail in ways she'd never seen before, Jennifer felt something she'd spent 3 decades training herself not to feel: genuine panic. It had started so subtly that she'd almost missed it. The autopilot had hiccuped, just the tiniest flutter of disconnect before resuming control. Jennifer had glanced at her co-pilot, David Park, a capable 42-year-old from Portland who was 3 years away from retirement. They'd exchanged a look that said nothing more than routine curiosity. These things happened. Aircraft were complex machines, and occasional electrical blips were part of the job. But then it happened again. A full disconnect. The autopilot completely disengaged, and the aircraft's nose suddenly pitched down by 5 degrees. Jennifer's hands were on the yoke immediately, her muscle memory taking over as she corrected the pitch. Her heart rate, which should have been steady, kicked up a notch. "Did you feel that?" she asked David quietly, keeping her voice level. Around them, the flight deck of the Boeing 737 hummed with the familiar rhythm of cruising at 37,000 feet. Everything looked normal. Everything should have been normal. "Felt like an autopilot glitch," David said, already reaching for the diagnostic panel. "I'll run through the checklist." Jennifer engaged the autopilot manually, a simple procedure where you basically told the system to try again. It came back online. For exactly 2 minutes and 30 seconds, everything was fine. Then the chaos began. The autopilot disconnected again, but this time something worse happened. The navigation systems started contradicting each other. The primary compass was giving one heading. The backup system was showing something completely different. The GPS, which should have been the most reliable system on the aircraft, was displaying impossible coordinates, placing them simultaneously over Arizona and Nevada, as if the aircraft was in 2 places at once. "What the hell?" Tom Larson, the flight engineer, leaned forward from his station. Tom was 51, a veteran who'd seen his share of problems, and his mild curse word indicated serious concern. Jennifer's mouth had gone dry. She was already disconnecting the autopilot and taking full manual control. The aircraft responded to her hands, steady and responsive, but those instrument readings were still flashing impossibly wrong data across her screens. "Run the navigation diagnostic," she ordered, keeping her voice steady even as her mind raced through possibilities. "Full system check, primary and backup." David's fingers flew across the keyboard. The cabin remained blissfully unaware, 160 passengers sipping drinks, reading books, sleeping through what was potentially becoming a serious emergency. Jennifer was acutely aware of that burden. Every single one of those people had placed their trust in her, had believed that boarding this flight meant they were safe. That responsibility had never felt heavier. The diagnostic came back, and what it revealed made Jennifer's stomach clench. Nothing was wrong. According to the system checks, every navigation component was functioning perfectly. But the readings told a completely different story. The instruments were working perfectly while simultaneously providing data that was mathematically impossible. "Sensor malfunction," Tom suggested, his weathered face creased with concentration. "Can't be," David said. "We'd have warning lights, redundancy failover." But even as he spoke, one of those warning lights suddenly illuminated. Not on the navigation panel, but on the autopilot system. A warning they'd never seen before in their combined experience. An impossible warning that suggested a cascade of failures that shouldn't be able to happen simultaneously. Jennifer's mind raced through her years of training. They taught you procedures for almost everything: engine failures, hydraulic loss, fire, decompression. But they couldn't teach you how to respond to a problem that shouldn't mathematically exist. They couldn't prepare you for systems that contradicted each other in ways that violated the basic redundancy principles that made modern aviation safe. She reached for the radio with steady hands, though inside she was anything but steady. "Houston, this is Flight 447. We're experiencing navigation system anomalies, primary and backup systems showing contradictory readings, requesting immediate assistance." The response from Houston came back within seconds, but even the controllers sounded uncertain. Navigation issues were rare, and ones this bizarre were practically non-existent. They walked Jennifer through standard troubleshooting procedures she and David had already initiated. Disengage the autopilot, check the circuit breakers, reset the system, wait for recalibration. Nothing worked. Jennifer was flying the aircraft manually now, following her last known valid heading, but without reliable navigation systems, they were essentially flying blind. They could see San Francisco on radar, but radar alone wasn't enough for precision flying. And if this problem cascaded further, if other systems started failing. She didn't let herself finish that thought. Tom was pale now, and Jennifer could see the fear he was trying to hide. David had stopped making suggestions and was staring at the impossible data, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. Jennifer's hands were steady on the control yoke, but her mind was fragmenting into 1,000 worst-case scenarios. She thought of her daughter, Emma, who was 14 and waiting at their home in Palo Alto. Emma, who had school the next morning and expected her mother to be home that night to help with her history project. Emma, who had no idea that her mother might be about to face the most critical decision of her career. Jennifer thought of the 160 people behind this cockpit door, the businessmen who had important meetings, the couples going on vacations, the families visiting sick relatives, the elderly people taking their final trips before they ran out of time, all of them trusting her. She thought of the protocols. You declare an emergency when safety is in question. You land at the nearest suitable airport. You do everything by the book. But declaring an emergency when you didn't fully understand what was happening, when you might be overreacting to a problem that could self-correct, that could cause unnecessary panic. Jennifer looked at her instruments. Everything was still wrong. The autopilot warning light was still illuminated. The navigation systems were still contradicting each other in impossible ways. Houston, advising that standard procedures are not resolving the issue, she said calmly into the radio. Requesting Vector to alternative airport for emergency landing if condition continues to degrade. She was buying time, but time might not save them. Flight 447 understood. Standing by, Houston responded. In that moment, with San Francisco still 55 minutes away, and her aircraft bleeding reliability with each passing second, Jennifer made a decision that violated every instinct telling her to handle this quietly and professionally. She turned to David and Tom. "I'm going to ask the cabin for help," she said quietly. "If there's a pilot on board with advanced systems experience, we might have options we don't know about yet." Tom nodded immediately. David looked uncertain but didn't object. Jennifer stood, steadied herself, and moved toward the cabin microphone. Her hand hesitated for just a moment. This would make it real, would acknowledge that she'd exhausted her own expertise and needed outside help. She pressed the button. The cabin of Flight 447 existed in that peculiar liminal space of mid-afternoon commercial flight. It wasn't quite the bustling chaos of a morning departure, nor the quiet slumber of a red-eye. People were scattered throughout in their various states of travel, some working on laptops, others reading, a few watching movies on their personal screens with headphones, and several sleeping with their heads against the windows or shoulders of traveling companions. The flight attendants were in the galley, preparing for the beverage service, discussing whether they'd start with aisle 7 or 8. The captain's announcement came through the speakers suddenly, cutting through the ambient hum of engines and human activity. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing a minor technical issue. If anyone aboard has significant aviation experience, particularly pilots, please ring your call button immediately." In seat 12C, a businessman's fingers paused above his laptop keyboard. He glanced up at the speaker, furrowed his brow, and returned to his work. Minor meant nothing to worry about. Commercial aircraft had redundancies built on top of redundancies. Pilots got announcements like this all the time, or so he believed. In seat 23F, an elderly woman reading a romance novel didn't even look up. She'd flown 40 times in her 78 years without incident. A minor technical issue meant nothing. She turned the page. In seat 5B, a mother with 2 young children didn't hear the announcement at all. Her 4-year-old son was asking increasingly creative questions about whether airplane bathrooms went down to a giant tank or directly into space, and her concentration was entirely consumed by figuring out an age-appropriate answer. But in seat 8A, the announcement hit like a defibrillator. Marcus Webb's eyes snapped open with the reflexive urgency that 22 years of military service had hardwired into his nervous system. There was something in that captain's voice, not panic, because professional pilots never allowed panic into their voices, but something underneath the careful control. A weight, a burden. He was awake instantly, completely, every system coming online. Not the slow, groaning awakening of civilian sleep, but the combat pilot awakening where consciousness returned like flipping a switch. His eyes, which had been closed in peaceful sleep seconds before, now scanned his immediate environment with tactical precision. The businessman next to him was still typing, unconcerned. The elderly woman across the aisle in 8C was still reading. Everything looked normal, but Marcus knew better. You didn't make an announcement asking for aviation expertise unless something was genuinely wrong. You didn't do that lightly. You didn't do that unless you'd already tried everything else. His heart rate elevated immediately, driven by muscle memory and instinct. His hands, which had been resting in his lap, became alert. His breathing deepened automatically, his body preparing for action the way it had been trained to do during 1,000 combat scenarios. The captain's announcement had specifically said, particularly pilots. Marcus was a pilot. Not just any pilot, a combat pilot with experience flying the most advanced military aircraft in existence. He'd handled systems failures during combat conditions that would have terrified most civilian aviators. He'd made split-second decisions while under fire that required reading instruments and managing catastrophic failures with enemy missiles on his tail. For the first time in 5 years of retirement, for the first time since leaving active duty, Marcus felt the old instinct rising. Someone needed help, and he had the skills they needed. The grief that had weighed on him for the past 2 weeks suddenly felt less important than responding to a crisis. He was out of his seat before his conscious mind had fully caught up with his body's decision. His finger found the call button and pressed it firmly. Once, twice. The weight of decision lifted slightly. He'd answered the call. Next to him, the businessman finally looked up, slightly annoyed at the sudden movement. The flight attendant in the galley, just beginning the beverage service, immediately appeared at the bulkhead, her face a mixture of confusion and concern. She'd been briefed that passengers should ring if they were sick or needed assistance. An immediate call after the captain's announcement meant something different. Marcus held her gaze as she approached, and without waiting for her to speak, he reached for his carry-on overhead. His movements were precise and practiced. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Sarah, watched with confusion as he pulled out a document wallet. He extracted his credentials, his military ID and pilot's license, and held them out. "I'm Captain Marcus Webb, retired Air Force," he said quietly, his voice steady and professional. "Combat pilot, 22 years active duty. I'm current on advanced systems and emergency procedures. The captain asked for pilots." Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the credentials. She was an experienced flight attendant who'd been flying for 15 years, and she'd never been briefed on this procedure. The captain's announcement had clearly indicated a genuine emergency, but she hadn't expected it to escalate so quickly. "I need to get you to the flight deck," she said, her professional composure slipping slightly. Her hand trembled as she took the credentials. "But security protocols, we need to verify everything." Marcus was already moving toward the front of the cabin. "I understand. Do it while I'm walking. The captain doesn't have time. I can feel it in how that announcement was delivered." It was an odd statement. You couldn't feel aviation crises through radio broadcasts. But Sarah, who had worked with enough professional pilots to recognize the real thing, understood what he meant. There was an authority in his voice, a certainty that came from genuine expertise. This wasn't someone role-playing or exaggerating credentials. This was a trained professional who recognized another professional in distress. As they moved through the first-class cabin toward the cockpit, Sarah spoke urgently into her headset, confirming Marcus's credentials with the captain directly. Around them, a few passengers noticed something unusual happening, but most remained absorbed in their own worlds. An elderly couple exchanged a worried glance. A young woman asked her husband if they should be concerned, but most people simply didn't register that anything unusual was occurring. Marcus, however, was entirely focused. As Sarah unlocked the cockpit door, a security procedure that had become standard after 9/11, Marcus's mind was already running through possibilities. Navigation system issues, engine problems, hydraulic failure. What combination of problems would make an experienced captain desperate enough to break protocol and ask for outside help? The cockpit door opened, and he stepped inside. Behind him, in seat 8A, his carry-on still hung in the overhead bin, his seat empty. The businessman who'd been next to him hadn't even noticed he'd left. The elderly woman across the aisle continued reading her romance novel. Flight 447 continued its path towards San Francisco, oblivious to the fact that everything had just changed. In the cockpit, Captain Jennifer Martinez looked at this stranger stepping into her domain, and for the first time in her career, she felt genuine hope that help might actually arrive before it was too late. The cockpit door closed behind Marcus with a pneumatic hiss, sealing him away from the normal world and into the pressure cooker of aviation's most critical space. The temperature felt several degrees warmer than the cabin, the air thick with the smell of electronic equipment, recycled atmosphere, and something else. The acrid scent of human adrenaline that you learn to recognize after enough years in high-stress environments. Captain Jennifer Martinez turned from the control yoke, and Marcus saw immediately that she was managing panic through sheer force of will. Her jaw was clenched, her hands gripping the control yoke with more tension than necessary, and her eyes had that particular quality of focused desperation that only comes when you're operating at the absolute edge of your expertise, and finding the edge isn't enough. "Captain Marcus Webb?" she asked, her voice steady but clipped. "Just Marcus," he said, moving into the compact space. "I'm retired military, but I'm current on emergency procedures. Walk me through what's happening." Jennifer gestured to the instrument panel, where a symphony of warning lights and contradictory readings created a visual nightmare. Primary navigation offline. Backup navigation contradicting primary on its last functional moments. Autopilot disconnecting randomly. We've run diagnostics 3 times. Every single system is reading as functional, but the data they're providing is mathematically impossible. Co-pilot David Park extended his hand. "David Park, I appreciate you being here." Marcus shook it, nodding the tension in David's grip. "Show me the timeline of failures. When did the first issue start? What was the sequence?" Tom Larson, the flight engineer, swiveled his seat to face them. He was visibly relieved to have backup, though professional pride made him want to prove he'd already done everything right. "Started 22 minutes ago with a minor autopilot hiccup. We didn't think much of it. Then it got worse. Disconnections, contradictory readings, and about 6 minutes ago this." He pointed to the warning light that shouldn't exist. Marcus leaned forward, studying the instrument panel like he was reading a critical patient's medical chart. His eyes traced the connections between systems, the logic flows, the redundancies. The F-15 was exponentially more complex than this 737, but the underlying principles were the same. Systems were designed to fail safely. Multiple redundancies ensured that one failure didn't cascade into catastrophe, but these failures shouldn't be happening together. "Can I see the maintenance logs for the last 72 hours?" he asked. Jennifer had already pulled them up. Marcus scanned them quickly. Nothing unusual. Recent maintenance on the backup compass system, routine calibration. Nothing that would cause this. He straightened up, his military training overriding the sleep he'd just been jerked from. "Okay, I'm seeing a pattern that's pointing toward a sensor malfunction cascade, but let me verify something. When the autopilot first disconnected, what was the exact sequence? Did instruments start showing wrong data before or after the disconnect?" David's eyes widened slightly. "After. Instruments started showing the contradiction maybe 30 seconds after the first disconnect." Marcus nodded slowly. That changed everything. If instruments had failed first, this would be a straightforward sensor problem. But if the disconnect came first, followed by instrument chaos, then something else was happening. The autopilot disconnect, was it a clean disconnect or a glitchy one? "Glitchy," Tom said. "Like the system couldn't decide whether to stay engaged or disengage." Marcus's mind was moving through possibilities like he was running through a combat checklist. Fighter jets had incredibly sophisticated redundancy systems that could fail in unexpected ways if the right combination of conditions occurred. And civilian aircraft, while simpler in some ways, were incredibly complex in others. The backup navigation system, how is it powered relative to the primary? "Different circuit," Jennifer said. "That was one of my first checks." Marcus turned to face her directly, and she saw something in his expression that made her relax slightly. This man understood the problem. More importantly, he didn't look like someone who was going to panic or second-guess them. "You did everything right. Your instincts were solid, but I think what we're looking at is a cascade that shouldn't be possible under normal circumstances. Tell me, have you tried a complete system reset? Not just autopilot, not just navigation, but a full systems reboot starting from the main computer." Jennifer and David exchanged looks. "That's extremely unusual," Jennifer said carefully. "A complete reboot at cruising altitude." "I understand the risk," Marcus interrupted, his tone not dismissive but urgent. "And normally I'd say don't do it. But right now, you're flying with systems that are giving you impossible data. That's more dangerous than a complete reboot. A reboot will give you a clean slate. If the problem is a cascading software error, which is what I think this is, a full reboot clears the error state." Tom was already unbuckling his restraint. "I can initiate from my station." "Before you do," Marcus said, "we need to agree on a fallback plan. If the reboot doesn't work, what's our alternative? Jennifer's mouth tightened. Emergency landing at the nearest suitable airport, probably Albuquerque or Phoenix. And if we don't have navigation? Marcus asked quietly. The cockpit went silent. That was the real fear, losing navigation entirely and being unable to land safely. Flying blind into a descent without instrument guidance was one of a pilot's worst nightmares. We'd still have radar, David said. Ground-based guidance. Would take time to coordinate, Marcus finished. Time that puts us on an emergency vector away from optimal landing sites. So here's what I think. We try the reboot. We give it 3 minutes. If systems don't stabilize, we declare an emergency and head toward Phoenix. It's closer than San Francisco, but we'll have options. Jennifer studied him for a long moment, and Marcus could see her making the calculation. This was her aircraft, her responsibility, and now her decision was whether to trust a stranger who'd walked onto her flight deck minutes ago. But she was also experienced enough to recognize genuine expertise when confronted with it. Okay, she said. Tom, initiate full systems reboot. David, coordinate with Houston. Tell them we're attempting a reboot procedure for navigation anomalies and we'll update them in 3 minutes. The cockpit shifted into a different kind of tension, the focused urgency of people executing a plan. Tom's hands moved across his station with practiced precision. David's voice, calm and professional, crackled through the radio to Houston. Jennifer maintained their current heading manually, her attention split between the control yoke and the instruments. Marcus watched the seconds tick by. 45 seconds, 90 seconds. The instruments remained dark as the system cycled through their shutdown sequence and prepared for restart. At 2 minutes and 10 seconds, the first lights began to glow, green across the board. Then the navigation systems powered back online, their displays stabilizing and solidifying as the systems recalibrated to the aircraft's actual position. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then the needles aligned. The compass readings matched. The GPS coordinates became sensible. They were exactly where they should be, flying toward San Francisco exactly as planned. All systems green, Tom whispered, almost in disbelief. Jennifer exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for minutes. Houston, Flight 447, we've successfully cleared our navigation issues. All systems are stabilized and nominal. We're continuing to San Francisco. Marcus felt something shift in the cockpit, the oppressive weight of crisis replaced with the manageable stress of flying a normal aircraft. He stepped back slightly, allowing Jennifer to take full control of her flight deck again. She turned to him and her eyes were glistening. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know what you—" "You knew what to try," Marcus interrupted. "You just needed someone to confirm you were thinking about it the right way. That's all I did." But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Sometimes, the difference between crisis and safety came down to having someone who'd trained for exactly this moment appear exactly when they were needed. Marcus looked at his watch. It was 2:31 p.m. In 38 minutes, they'd be landing in San Francisco. One of the most important flights of his life had just become infinitely more important, and nobody in the back cabin would ever know how close they'd come to disaster. The reboot sequence had begun, and the cockpit existed in a strange liminal space where the aircraft was flying, but its electronic nervous system was temporarily offline. Jennifer maintained manual control, her hands steady on the yoke despite the enormity of what they were attempting. Flying a commercial aircraft without modern navigation systems was something pilots trained for in simulators, but never actually wanted to experience in real life. The margin for error was paper-thin. Marcus positioned himself behind Jennifer's seat, where he could see both the main instrument panel and Tom's engineering station. His eyes tracked the reboot sequence with the precision of someone who'd spent 22 years reading instrument panels under maximum stress. Unlike most observers, he understood exactly what was happening at each stage of the shutdown and restart cycle. "How long have we been without primary navigation?" he asked, not as a criticism but as a factual question that mattered tactically. 3 minutes and 42 seconds, Tom reported. "Houston is standing by. They're ready to vector us toward Phoenix if needed. Marcus nodded. 3 minutes was manageable, but only just. Beyond 5 minutes, and the fuel calculations started getting complicated. Beyond 10, an emergency landing became truly critical. They were in the window where a solution was possible but not infinite. The instrument panels remained dark. Just the hum of the engines, the gentle pressure of air against the fuselage, and the silent prayer that experienced aviators never voiced but always felt. Please let this work. Talk me through the backup battery systems, Marcus said to Tom. If the reboot doesn't fully clear the cascading error, we might need to manually reset specific subsystems rather than running everything together. Tom's eyes lit up with the recognition that this wasn't just someone offering comfort. This was someone thinking 3 steps ahead. The backup batteries power the navigation computers independently, if the cascade is software-based rather than hardware-based. Then resetting the hardware while allowing the software to fully clear might be the solution, Marcus finished. You're thinking correctly. That's our fallback plan. Jennifer listened to this exchange while maintaining perfect pressure on the control yoke. She was flying an aircraft the size of a school bus carrying 160 human beings, trusting instruments that might or might not come back online, and she was listening to 2 men discuss contingency plans for a contingency plan. Most people would have found it terrifying. Jennifer found it reassuring. At least they were thinking. At 2 minutes and 50 seconds, the first instruments flickered. Just momentary, a brief electronic hiccup as the systems ran their internal diagnostic checks. "Come on," Tom whispered, not quite to anyone in particular. 3 minutes. The compass needle quivered, caught between sleep and waking. The altitude indicator remained dark. The airspeed indicator showed nothing. At 3 minutes and 15 seconds, the altitude indicator came alive, spinning briefly before settling on their current height, 36,800 feet. Correct. Exactly where they should be. David Park's hands tightened on his armrests. Jennifer's breathing remained steady, but her eyes were locked on the instruments. The compass needle spun, searching for magnetic north, and then locked in. The heading matched what it should be. The navigation display, the most critical system, began its boot sequence. The screen flickered once, twice, and then data appeared. A blue circle showed their aircraft's position. The line showing their flight path stretched toward San Francisco. All the numbers were correct. All the readings were coherent. The impossible cascade of errors that had nearly derailed their entire flight had been cleared. "Navigation systems online," Tom announced, his voice cracking with emotion. "All readings nominal, all systems green across the board." For exactly 3 seconds, nobody said anything. Then Jennifer's shoulders relaxed infinitesimally. "Thank you," she said quietly to no one in particular. Then louder into the radio. "Houston, Flight 447. Navigation systems have been successfully restored. We're reading all green across the board, continuing to San Francisco with no issues." Houston's response came back immediately. "Flight 447, we show you at full functionality. Excellent work. You're cleared to continue on your original flight plan and descent profile." Jennifer turned in her seat to look at Marcus. "That was brilliant," she said simply. "I don't know if we would have thought of that." "You would have," Marcus said, and he meant it. "You're an experienced captain flying an aircraft you know intimately. You had the knowledge. I just had the benefit of stepping back and seeing the problem with fresh eyes. And honestly, my background with military systems that are far more complicated than this actually made this simpler. When you're used to handling 10 simultaneous failures, a single cascading software error is almost straightforward." David Park extended his hand again, this time as genuine thanks rather than introduction. "You saved our lives. You know that, right?" Marcus shook it firmly. "What we did together was solve a problem as a team. You handled the aircraft. Tom managed the systems. Jennifer made the critical decisions. I just recognized a pattern. That's how aviation safety works. It's never one person. It's people understanding their roles and working together." It was a humble answer, and Tom Larson recognized it as coming from someone who understood the culture of professional aviation. Egos had no place in the cockpit. Credit belonged to the entire team, and taking individual glory was how mistakes happened. Over the next 30 minutes, Marcus remained in the cockpit, working with Jennifer and her crew to verify that all systems remained stable. They ran diagnostics on the navigation computers, the autopilot system, and the backup power supplies. Everything checked out. The problem, whatever it had been, a sensor malfunction compounded by software cascade, some combination of failures that shouldn't have been able to happen together, had been completely resolved. At 3,000 feet, with San Francisco International Airport visible ahead and the city sprawling below them in the afternoon sunlight, Jennifer engaged the autopilot for the final approach. The system engaged smoothly, responded to input commands correctly, and guided them toward the runway with perfect precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain," Jennifer announced through the cabin speakers. "We're beginning our descent into San Francisco. We'll be on the ground in approximately 12 minutes. On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for flying with us today." She caught Marcus's eye as she made the announcement. They both understood what that announcement really meant. It was gratitude. It was acknowledgement. It was a captain's way of saying thank you to someone who'd answered a desperate call. As they descended through the clouds, the golden afternoon light streaming through the cockpit windows, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The grief that had weighed on him for weeks was still there, still heavy, but it was joined now by something else, a sense of purpose. A reminder that sometimes your training, your expertise, and your willingness to answer when called could make a tangible difference. He thought of Tommy, of Jimmy, of David, the friends he'd buried over the past weeks. He thought of Sarah's words, "Don't spend what's left of your life just being brave for the rest of us." Maybe, he thought, this was what living actually meant. Not just surviving, not just going through the motions, but being present and useful when the moment demanded it. Not seeking recognition, but showing up anyway. The landing gear lowered with a mechanical thunk. The runway grew larger below them. The wheels were about to touch down, and Flight 447 would safely complete its journey. And somewhere in the back cabin, 160 passengers who had no idea how close they'd come to a serious emergency were getting their bags ready, thinking about their destinations, completely unaware that they owed their safe arrival to a sleeping man in Seat 8A who'd answered a captain's desperate call. The wheels of Flight 447 touched down on runway 28 left at San Francisco International Airport with barely a whisper, the kind of landing that experienced aviators called greasing it in. Jennifer Martinez had flown this same runway hundreds of times, but this landing felt different. It felt like a second chance. The aircraft rolled down the runway, the reverse thrusters engaging with a roar that could be felt throughout the cabin, bringing their speed down from 150 miles per hour to a manageable taxi speed. Passengers who'd been lightly dozing or staring out windows suddenly became aware that they'd arrived. People began unbuckling seatbelts, reaching for phones, preparing to gather their belongings. None of them knew they'd nearly died 38 minutes ago. In the cockpit, Tom Larson released a breath he'd been holding unconsciously since Marcus arrived. David Park was running the post-landing checklist with religious precision, and Jennifer was radioing ground control confirmation that they'd landed safely. Everything was procedure. Everything was normal, except nothing was normal, and everyone in that cockpit knew it. As they taxied toward the gate, Jennifer turned to Marcus. She unbuckled her seatbelt and extended her hand. Her eyes were glistening, and she made no effort to hide it. In 32 years of flying, she'd never felt more grateful to anyone in her life. "Captain Webb," she said formally, her voice trembling slightly, "what you did today, it goes beyond flying. You saved us. You saved all of us." Marcus took her hand. "You would have gotten here safely, Jennifer. You have the skills and the knowledge. You just needed confidence, and I helped provide that. But let me be clear about something. The credit belongs to you, to David, to Tom, and to everyone who trained you. I was just a convenient expert in the right place at the right time." "No," David said firmly, unbuckling his own seatbelt. "What you did was remarkable. You didn't panic. You thought clearly. You gave us options when we didn't think options existed. That's not just expertise, that's heroism." Tom was already moving toward Marcus, his weathered face creased with genuine emotion. "If you ever need anything, and I mean anything, you call me. You have my number by the end of the day. Thank you for reminding me why I do this job." The cockpit was cramped, and 4 people expressing gratitude in that small space created an atmosphere thick with emotion. But there was also the practical reality that they were now at the gate, and the flight attendants were preparing to open the cabin doors. The moment of privacy was ending. "I need to ask you something," Jennifer said as they heard the sounds of passengers beginning to stand and retrieve their belongings. "What do you want me to tell people?" Marcus thought about this. The truth was complicated. A crisis that had been averted. A passenger who happened to have exactly the expertise needed. It could be made into a story, the kind of story that made people feel good about aviation safety. Or it could be the simple truth about a team of professionals doing their jobs competently. "Tell them the truth," he said finally. "That we experienced a navigation system issue, that I helped work through the problem, and that we landed safely. Leave out the parts that would scare people, but don't minimize the fact that this crew did everything right." Jennifer nodded. She understood the balance he was trying to strike. As Marcus moved back through the cockpit door and into the cabin, Sarah, the flight attendant who'd escorted him to the flight deck, was waiting. Her eyes went wide with relief when she saw him. "Oh my God," she said. "We all knew something was wrong, but nobody really understood how bad it was until the captain made that announcement. Thank you so much." "Everyone's fine," Marcus said. "That's what matters." But as he walked through first class toward his seat, he noticed that several passengers had turned to look at him. Word had apparently spread somehow, the invisible network of whispered conversations that move through aircraft the way rumors move through small towns. A woman in 1A reached out and touched his arm. An elderly man nodded at him with profound understanding in his eyes. By the time Marcus reached seat 8A to retrieve his carry-on, the entire front cabin was watching him. Not with fear, but with a strange mixture of relief and curiosity. Something had happened. They didn't know exactly what, but they knew something. The businessman who'd been sitting next to Marcus was packing his laptop. He looked up, recognition dawning on his face. "You're the pilot who helped, aren't you?" Marcus simply nodded, reaching for his bag. "We heard the captain was asking for help," the businessman continued. "We didn't really understand what was happening until we started hearing people talking. You fixed the navigation system." "The crew fixed the navigation system," Marcus corrected gently. "I just helped them think through the problem." But even as he said it, he could see the narrative forming. A retired military pilot, a crisis, a solution. It was the kind of story that people wanted to believe in, proof that expertise, calm professionalism, and heroism still existed in the world. As Marcus made his way toward the cabin door, he passed a young woman in 12D who was recording on her phone. She was speaking quietly into the device, clearly describing what she'd heard about what had happened. Marcus made a mental note that in the age of social media, privacy was increasingly impossible. This story was going to spread. At the cabin door, Captain Jennifer Martinez was standing with David Park and Tom Larson. She'd left the flight deck to personally thank Marcus as he departed. The flight attendants created a small pocket of space around them, an unspoken acknowledgement that this moment mattered. "San Francisco is going to be lucky to have you for the next 10 days, Jennifer said. "And if you ever decide to come out of retirement, every airline in the country would hire you immediately." Marcus smiled. It was a genuine smile, the first one he'd managed in weeks that didn't feel forced. "I'm just going to try to relax, walk on a beach, and remember how to be a person instead of a uniform, but I'll never forget today." He descended the jet bridge into the airport terminal, pulling his carry-on behind him, and felt the strange experience of stepping from one world into another. Behind him, the aircraft was being cleaned, refueled, and prepared for its next flight. The crew would file reports. The airline would investigate the navigation system malfunction. Engineers would study what had gone wrong. But in the terminal, as Marcus made his way toward the baggage claim and ground transportation, he noticed people staring at him. A security officer gave him a nod that seemed to carry special meaning. A ground crew member who'd been walking past suddenly stopped and came back. "Are you the pilot?" the ground crew member asked. "We heard something happened on 447. "Just a passenger who happened to be useful," Marcus said. But the narrative was already beyond his control. By the time he reached the rental car counter, his phone buzzed with a notification. A social media post with a timestamp from about 15 minutes ago. A passenger named Derek Chen had posted, "Just landed in SFO. Our plane nearly had a serious navigation failure at 35,000 feet. A retired combat pilot on board helped the captain and crew solve the problem." Modern aviation is incredible. Everyone did their job perfectly and nobody panicked. Flying is safe because of people like this. The post already had 73 comments and was being shared rapidly. Marcus put his phone away without reading them. He had 10 days in San Francisco, 10 days to decompress, to grieve his friends, to remember how to live. He had no idea that those 10 days would change everything. By Friday morning, less than 24 hours after Flight 447 landed safely in San Francisco, Marcus Webb had become a trending topic on social media. The story had evolved from Derek Chen's simple post into something far more elaborate. News outlets had picked it up. Aviation blogs had analyzed it. Aviation safety experts had commented on it. And somehow, in that strange alchemy of digital culture, a routine flight crisis that had been averted had transformed into the story of a guardian angel at 35,000 feet. Marcus had discovered this while sitting in the lobby of his hotel, drinking terrible coffee and reading the San Francisco Chronicle on his phone. The headline read, "Retired Air Force Combat Pilot Saves Flight to San Francisco, Diagnoses Critical Navigation Failure Mid-Flight." The article was respectful and mostly accurate, though it had taken some liberties with the drama of the situation. It described Marcus as a decorated veteran, mentioned his 22 years of service, quoted anonymous sources saying the navigation failure could have been catastrophic, and portrayed his arrival at the flight deck as some kind of movie moment. It didn't mention that Jennifer Martinez and her crew had been perfectly capable of handling the situation themselves, given time. It focused entirely on Marcus as the hero. His phone rang at 8:47 a.m., unknown number. Marcus had ignored unknown numbers his entire life, but something made him answer this time. "Captain Webb," a woman's voice, professional and enthusiastic. "This is Rachel Morrison from NBC's Morning News. We'd love to have you on our show to talk about what happened on Flight 447 yesterday. We're thinking a national segment, maybe even consideration for one of our longer-form features." Marcus's stomach twisted. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not really interested in." "We're thinking somewhere between 8 and 10 million viewers," Rachel continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "This story is resonating with people, Captain. People care about heroism. They want to hear from you." "I don't feel like a hero," Marcus said, which was true. "Well, that's exactly why you should do this," Rachel said. "Genuine, humble heroes, that's what people respond to. Can we schedule something for Monday morning? We'll send a car to pick you up from your hotel." Marcus hung up the phone without committing to anything. He'd never liked being the center of attention, and the idea of explaining what happened on national television made his skin crawl. But the calls kept coming. By noon, he'd received interview requests from CNN, ABC, Good Morning America, and at least 24 aviation-focused podcasts. Each one positioned him as the hero of the story. Each one seemed to believe that his expertise and willingness to help were somehow extraordinary, when to Marcus they felt like the most obvious response to a crisis. He went for a walk along the Embarcadero, trying to clear his head. The San Francisco Bay spread before him, gray-blue and indifferent to human drama. A group of tourists recognized him from the Chronicle article, which had included a photo from his Air Force service records. They asked for a selfie. He politely declined, but they took one anyway, standing next to him and grinning while he stared straight ahead. By evening, he'd received over 200 emails, job offers from airlines, speaking invitations from universities, A request from a publishing company asking if he'd be interested in writing a memoir. A foundation devoted to aviation safety wanted him on their board. A flight school wanted him to teach. The offers were flattering and they were relentless. But there was also something else in his inbox. A handwritten letter that had been scanned and emailed to him through the airline from someone who'd been on Flight 447. "Dear Captain Webb," it began. "I was flying with my 2 children to visit their grandmother who has terminal cancer. If something had happened to that flight, I never would have got to say goodbye. You not only saved my life and my children's lives, but you saved me from a devastation I can't even articulate. Thank you. Thank you for being on that flight. Thank you for answering when called. My children will grow up knowing that there are good people in this world who show up when it matters." Marcus sat on the hotel bed and cried. The first time he'd let himself truly cry since burying Tommy. That night he called Robert, his friend who owned the beach house. "So you're famous now," Robert said with amusement. "I was wondering when you'd call. My wife has been checking social media every hour. There's a hashtag, Marcus. Guardian Adel 35,000. That's what people are calling you." "This is ridiculous," Marcus said flatly. "Yes," Robert agreed. "But it's also kind of beautiful. You helped people, and now other people want to believe in that story. There's something fundamentally human about that." "I didn't do anything special," Marcus said. "I solved a problem. Jennifer and her crew could have solved it on their own. I just happened to be there." "Exactly," Robert said. "You were there, you answered the call, you didn't have to, you could have pretended to sleep, you could have ignored it, but you didn't. And that matters, Marcus. Stop diminishing what you did." Over the weekend, the story evolved further. A video had surfaced, apparently taken by a flight attendant, showing Marcus walking through first class before exiting the aircraft. It was grainy and brief, maybe 20 seconds, but it was him. The video had been viewed over 3 million times on YouTube. The comments section was a surreal mixture of genuine gratitude, wild speculation, and people debating whether he should run for political office. A woman had started a Change.org petition asking the Air Force to decorate Marcus with an additional medal of commendation. It already had 47,000 signatures. An aviation blog had called him the most important pilot nobody knew existed. A major network morning show had done a segment on Heroes Among Us that featured Marcus's photo alongside 4 other people who'd performed acts of bravery or kindness. By Sunday evening, Marcus felt like he was drowning in someone else's narrative. He sat on the balcony of Robert's beach house, looking out at the Pacific Ocean, and thought about Tommy. Tommy would have found this entire situation hilarious. The idea of Marcus becoming a viral celebrity would have made him laugh for hours. Tommy had always said that Marcus took himself too seriously, that he should loosen up and let people appreciate him. Well, Marcus thought grimly, people certainly were appreciating him now. Thousands of strangers who had no idea who he actually was had decided he was a hero. His phone buzzed, a text from Jennifer Martinez. "Are you okay? The media requests have been insane. I haven't answered anyone yet. I wanted to know what you wanted me to say." Marcus stared at the text. Jennifer's question was exactly the right one. She wasn't trying to capitalize on the moment. She wasn't seeking attention. She was checking on him and asking permission before she spoke to the press. He typed back, "Tell them the truth. Tell them you handled the crisis competently. Tell them I was just a passenger with relevant expertise. Tell them that good aviation safety comes from teams doing their jobs well." Her response was immediate, "Got it. I'll handle it my way. But Marcus, what you did was real. Don't let the media circus make you doubt that." He appreciated her attempt to reassure him, but the truth was more complicated. Yes, he'd helped. Yes, his expertise had made a difference. But he wasn't comfortable being called a hero for doing what any trained professional would have done. And he wasn't comfortable with the idea that his entire life story was about to become public property, dissected and analyzed by strangers on the internet. By Monday morning, the requests had multiplied exponentially. The Today Show wanted him. Ellen wanted him. There were magazine offers, book deals, speaking circuit opportunities. A company manufacturing aircraft equipment wanted to use his name in their advertising. Someone had created merchandise, T-shirts with Guardian at 35000 printed on them. He was apparently making money for people he'd never met by simply being the person in a story they'd decided to tell about him. Marcus sat in his hotel room, staring at his phone, and realized something fundamental. He couldn't stop the narrative. He could participate in it or refuse to participate in it, but he couldn't change it. The story had taken on a life of its own, and he was no longer the storyteller. He was just the subject. He thought about Sarah's words again. Don't spend what's left of your life just being brave for the rest of us. Was being overwhelmed by public attention a form of being brave? Or was it cowardice, letting other people's narratives define who he was instead of claiming his own story? He had no answer, but he knew one thing. Answering that call on Flight 447 had changed everything, and he still wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a burden. Marcus Webb stood in front of a high school auditorium filled with 400 teenagers, and he still felt like a fraud. 2 months had passed since Flight 447 landed safely in San Francisco. 2 months since a captain's desperate announcement had interrupted his sleep. 2 months since he'd solved a navigation system problem that had been fascinating to his engineer's mind, but terrifying to everyone else involved. And somehow, in those 2 months, his entire life had been reconstructed into a narrative about heroism that he still struggled to believe in. He turned down the morning show interviews. He declined the book deals and the merchandise contracts. He'd refused the job offers from airlines eager to capitalize on his name. But this, standing in front of teenagers at Lincoln High School in his hometown of Albuquerque, speaking to an auditorium of people young enough to be his children, this he couldn't refuse. The principal had called him personally. Captain Webb, we have students who are interested in aviation, engineering, and military service. We'd love for you to tell them about the importance of preparation and readiness. It would mean so much to these young people to hear from you. Marcus had almost said no. But then he thought about Tommy in that hospital bed, about Jimmy in the ground at Arlington, about David Chen, who'd never got to see his daughter graduate. He thought about Sarah's words echoing in his mind, and he'd agreed. Now, standing on the stage, looking at 400 curious faces, he decided to tell them the truth. I'm not a hero, he began, his voice carrying through the auditorium with the authority of someone who'd spent decades speaking authoritatively over the noise of jet engines. I'm going to start with that because I think there's a misunderstanding about what happened on Flight 447, and I want to clear it up. I was a passenger who happened to have relevant expertise. Nothing more, nothing less. He clicked to a slide showing the flight path of the 737. This is what I want to talk about today. Not about me, but about preparation, about showing up, about understanding that sometimes the difference between catastrophe and safety is simply being the person in the room who's thought through the problem before the problem occurs. For the next 40 minutes, Marcus talked about his career, not the glamorous parts, not the combat missions or the narrow escapes, but the grinding, unglamorous parts, the early morning simulator training, the study sessions for systems knowledge, the thousands of hours spent learning procedures, understanding failures, drilling for emergencies that hopefully would never occur. I wasn't special that day, he told them. I just happened to have spent 22 years preparing for a moment that most pilots never experience, and when that moment came, my body and my mind knew what to do because they'd been trained for it. A girl in the third row raised her hand during the question period. Do you think you were meant to be on that plane? She asked earnestly. Marcus paused. It was the question that had haunted him for 2 months. Was it coincidence, fate, divine intervention, or simply the intersection of his grief-driven decision to take a flight and a navigation system malfunction on that particular aircraft? I think, he said carefully, that sometimes the universe conspires, but usually it requires us to show up first. I was supposed to be on that plane because I chose to be on it, because I was willing to answer when called, and because I'd spent my life preparing to answer calls like that. I don't think fate intervenes in people's lives, but I think our preparation meets opportunity, and that's when things that look like fate happen. After the presentation, students came up to talk to him. An aspiring fighter pilot wanted advice. A girl interested in aviation safety engineering asked about career paths. A boy who wanted to join the military asked what it meant to truly serve something larger than yourself. And then an elderly man approached, someone who wasn't a student, who must have been a teacher or staff member. He extended his hand. "Thank you for being here," he said. "I teach history, and I'm tired of young people thinking that heroism is dead. They need to see that real courage is what you do when nobody's watching, the preparation you do for emergencies that might never come." Marcus shook his hand and something shifted inside him. Maybe this was the real purpose of the story, not to make him famous, but to remind people that preparation mattered, that showing up mattered, that the decision to stay sharp, to keep learning, to be ready for calls that might never come was fundamentally important. That evening, back in his hotel room, Marcus received an email from Captain Jennifer Martinez. "Marcus, I wanted you to know that something important happened," she wrote. "The FAA did a comprehensive review of the navigation system malfunction. They've issued new protocols for our entire fleet based on what happened. Your insight about the cascading software error led to a firmware update that will prevent this type of failure from ever happening again. You didn't just save one flight, you made the entire system safer for everyone." Below that was another email from Tom Larson, the flight engineer. "Marcus, I wanted to tell you something personal. After that flight, I was thinking about retiring. I was tired. I felt like I'd seen everything the job had to offer. But that day reminded me why I got into this. I've decided to stay on another 5 years, and I'm mentoring younger engineers now, specifically training them the way you demonstrated on the flight deck, thinking systemically, understanding how failures cascade, preparing for problems before they happen. You inspired me to pass that on." And another from David Park. "I've requested a transfer to pilot training development. I want to create new curriculum based on that crisis. We're calling it Advanced Diagnostic Thinking Under Pressure. Because of you, the next generation of pilots will have better training than we did. Thank you for that." Marcus sat on his hotel bed and realized something profound. The viral story, the hashtags, the media requests, all of that had been noise. The real legacy wasn't about him becoming famous. The real legacy was systemic change. It was other professionals being inspired to improve their craft. It was people understanding that showing up mattered. He called Robert. "I think I understand now," Marcus said, "why this happened, why it mattered." "Tell me," Robert said. "Wasn't about saving one flight or becoming famous," Marcus explained. "It was about reminding people, a whole system of people in aviation, young people thinking about their futures, professionals wondering if their work still mattered, that preparation, commitment, and willingness to answer calls matters. Tommy would have hated the publicity, but he would have loved knowing that the ripples of this one moment are changing how pilots are trained, how systems are designed, how people think about their responsibilities." That weekend, Marcus visited Arlington Cemetery. He stood at Tommy's grave, and he finally allowed himself to speak. "I think I understand now," he said to the headstone. "Why Sarah told me not to spend the rest of my life being brave. I wasn't living before that flight, I was just existing, going through motions, honoring the dead by being sad instead of by being useful. That phone call, that crisis, it reminded me that there's a difference between surviving and living. Living means showing up. Living means using what you know. Living means believing that your preparation, your knowledge, your willingness to help actually matters." He placed flowers on the grave and sat quietly for a long time. When he finally returned to Albuquerque, Marcus didn't go back to his quiet retirement. He accepted a position teaching at the Air Force Academy, mentoring the next generation of pilots. He worked with the FAA on aviation safety curriculum. He volunteered with young people interested in STEM careers. He stayed sharp, stayed engaged, stayed ready. The social media excitement eventually faded. The hashtags disappeared. New stories captured the internet's attention. But the real work, the quiet, unglamorous work of preparation, mentoring, and continuous improvement continued. Years later, when someone would ask Marcus about Flight 447, he would smile and talk about the crew. He would talk about how crisis often requires collaboration. But most importantly, he would talk about what Tommy's wife had told him on that terrible day at the funeral, that the most important thing a person could do is truly live. And Marcus, who'd spent so many years just being brave for others, had finally learned to be alive for himself. The universe hadn't conspired to put him on that flight, but his preparation had met opportunity at exactly the right moment, and in answering one desperate call, he'd learned how to answer the call to actually living. Sometimes the greatest legacy isn't the moment of heroism. It's everything that comes after, the systems improved, the people inspired, the knowledge passed forward, the quiet work of making the world slightly safer and slightly better because someone showed up, paid attention, and cared enough to act. That was the real story of Flight 447, not the crisis that was averted, but the lives that were changed, his own most of all.